Hello ladies and gents, Hagbard Celine here on another beautiful afternoon, and today I'm going to be answering the numerous Q&A questions that were left in the comments section. Before we do, however, I'd like to acknowledge that as of me making this video, apparently the numbers say I'm Satan. The first question is one that I get frequently and I should probably use as the first question. It also was the first one that was left, so appropriate. Wait, have you served prison time? For how long and what were you serving for? Just curious. Well, I was in for about a year, although off and on I was doing time for longer than that, but the total stretch was about a year, and I was in for cultivation of marijuana, being my main charge. To reveal the rest would make it quite easy to Google me, so I'm going to pass on that. After watching this, I've become certain that watching The Godfather, The Wire, and similar does have a real-life benefit. Well, this isn't really a question, but a comment I couldn't help but answer in this format. No. No, it really won't. As a matter of fact, it could give you a false impression of what is good and proper behavior in these social circles that could get you hurt even worse. This comes across as a creepypasta with the musical tone in the abandoned prison. He could talk to the Dimension Bucket guys about doing some creepypastas. Well, as of reading this comment, I just have, and we'll see what they say, although I doubt I'll hear anything. What the fuck, is this real? Yes. Have you ever watched Locked Up Abroad? Yes, I have indeed watched that show, and ironically I only started watching shows like that after I got out. What do you think is the primary factor in determining whether it is reasonable and defensible to commit retaliatory violence? Well, it's about degrees. If you're talking about legality, it's about degrees. If you're talking about within the system that we were talking about in the above video, i.e. in prison, there really aren't a whole lot of rules. There's more like subtle suggestions. There's more like ideas of what other people will think of you for the retaliatory violence or how it's committed. It's somewhat similar as the legal code insofar as if you can defend having retaliated with violence and you can convince enough people that it was defensible, it becomes defensible. It's kind of a complex issue. How do you feel about using trains to transport undesirable minorities to certain camps where they can learn new job skills, such as ammunition assembly? For the Q&A. I see what you did there. Clever girl. Do you think there is any crime worth the risk of going back? Well, there are things that potentially could be deemed as a crime, as in sometimes an act, and my state luckily isn't one of these, but like in California, if you defend yourself against someone breaking into your home through the use of violence, I believe that's no longer legally allowed. I disagree with that and would probably still use force to keep someone from continually breaking into my home. So kind of depends on what you mean by that. You were smart to apologize to the gentleman in such a gentlemanly way. It was the only option I had. There are many things that you can call me, but there's one thing you can't ascribe to pretty much anyone who's behind bars. You might be quick, but you're not that fucking smart. What is the first thing you did when you got out after you served your time? Actually, I smoked a real human cigarette. That was literally the first thing I did when I stepped out of the gate, which ironically got me yelled at by the guards because you're not allowed to smoke in the parking lot of the prison. But, you know, that's me. Weren't you also in the Navy? No, I'm sorry to disappoint. I was never in the Navy. My grandfather was in the Navy and my stepbrother was in the Navy, so I've heard Navy stories, but I myself have never served. Another Hagbard video. I guess I will hold off joining ISIS until this is done. Well, at least I bought a little bit of peace, I suppose. What law is the least enforced? I imagine that's regional. I can only imagine. That has to vary from region to region. Public intoxication on a grand scale is probably the least enforced, where if you see a drunk walking down the street, even most cops, unless he's giving someone a hard time, are just going to bounce him back towards his house. Or somewhere quiet, or back into a bar. Because it is interesting that you're allowed to be drunk in a bar and not drunk in public. My question is, I have always wanted to know about the whole prison rape in the shower. Is that something that's real or just a myth? How bad are the gangs in prison, and how are non-gang members / white people treated? Well, I've never heard of or personally witnessed anyone being raped in the showers. I think that's something that's mostly been glorified on TV. Mostly because showers, traditionally, even in maximum security, have someone standing in them, as in a CO, or standing close enough that they can see. In our particular case, our showers were in the dorm. They were just They were just against a wall right next to the pod box where the COs would just literally stand and watch a shower just to make sure no funny business was going on, we're sure. No cockhawks among the COs, I'm sure. How bad are the gangs in prison? In my particular prison, they weren't that bad. Heard of it being worse in FDL. Florida State Prison, FSP, is a nightmare from what I've heard. But the few that I saw in my time, they weren't all that bad. They were a handful of harder clicks, but mostly they couldn't get enough traction to get anything going. What are, in your personal opinion, the scariest and most hilarious experiences of your life? I'm going to have to plead the fifth until I can research well enough whether they fall under statutes of limitations or not. But for some examples, one of the strangest and most hilarious experiences of my life was being at someone's private party / rave, everybody being on some form of a hallucinogenic drug, and having the person in the parking lot at like 4 o'clock in the morning who is not related to the party have the fire department called on them because their fucking car lit on fire in just an apartment complex parking lot. And we all just kind of sat there and watched it burn, and a couple of us went over and tried to help despite the fact that they were out of their head on ecstasy. That was pretty hilarious. The reaction of a bunch of acid heads to sirens and lights is always hilarious. Of course, that could easily fall into one of my scariest experiences if it weren't for times I've had guns pointed at my face. Do you have a hook penis? Who told you? Who have you been talking to? Has your time in prison changed you for the better? If so, how? I would say so. It made me more stable, a little bit more quiet. I tend to mostly be more reserved than I had been in my previous life, which was a safety precaution then. But the first thing you learn in prison is the safest position to be in is someone watching. And when you get to a new area, the safest thing to do is to sit quietly and learn the ropes by simply observing people. Don't rely on other people. Don't rely on their input. Don't rely on their opinion or their observations of a situation. I thought that was invaluable. That and the inevitable lesson in self-reliance that kind of situation teaches you. Do you believe once the social justice hold in the mainstream is relinquished, we will see the alt-right take the place, or some kind of right-wing equivalent to social justice? As it were, I'd say that arguably the first defense warriors were on the right when it came to things like blasphemy law and the very strict speech codes and control that were in place in universities and schools between, well, frankly, during wartime and then the remnants of that. However, it's a pendulum issue. As soon as whoever's in control is going to abuse that power. That's the inevitable end result of power, is the abuse of that power. So it doesn't surprise me that one side cries offense as long as power is derived from crying offense. It used to be in history, philosophically speaking, that simply crying offense or simply crying damage was not a sign of power, or it was not a way to derive power. As a matter of fact, it was a way to do nothing more than derive ridicule. But that story's flipped a bit. Can you tell us about private prisons? How do they work? Private prisons are varied as much as any other prison. I've heard some horror stories about the overwhelming control that's elicited on you in a private prison, and then I've heard that some private prisons are like vacation homes. I had one friend of mine that said basically it was as soon as you were in the gate and you had your bunking assignment, as long as you were there for count, the doors were always open. You just kind of wandered around. Commissary was always open. Big screen TVs, nice guards, paid well. So it's kind of, I'm sure, up in the air. I'm sure there are some really shitty private prisons too. So, I'm wondering, how ghetto was your upbringing? I myself have lived in many a ghetto, perhaps not as fucked up as some, but still. But it seems, just of how you speak of it, it sounds like you've been through the shit. Not sure if it's a question or not, but hey, it's enough of a question. I was raised in a moderately middle-income household, but I was also very much in an area that was declining. If you go back to my neighborhood now, you'd understand. It was a moderately middle-income area, and then that slowly stopped being true, and the upper middle-class area migrated, as it always does, leaving behind those that couldn't, as it always does. Foreigners from Latin nations have race wars in prisons with blacks. Islam is spreading through the black prison population. Do you think we should televise this? I think we do. I think that we televise it quite a bit. I think quite a few people are aware that this is something that's happening, but the only people that are aware of it are the people that want to be. Nobody cares. Truth be told, nobody gives a shit what happens in prison, state, federal, doesn't really matter. No one cares. When your average population hears about something like this, they just go, well, yeah, of course, or who cares? Most people are not going to be moved to care about the situations that are occurring inside of state prisons. And frankly, you can't really blame them. The unfortunate truth is that there's something to the old saying that there are only two types of people in prison. People that shouldn't be there in the first place, and people that probably should never be let out. What is the proportion of inmates who were clicked up in gangs before they got to prison, and what is the proportion of those who were clicked up in prison? In mine, again, not high. When it comes right down to it, it was a sliding scale. And it was pretty obvious those that were clicked up on any side. They usually are the ones that had pretty visible old prison tattoos, working on second or third letters, as it were. You have to understand, it's hard to really see whether they were clicked up in prison the first time. If they'd been to prison and this was their 5th time, then obviously they came in as gang members. But did they become gang members at 16 in a boys' camp? It's impossible to really tell where they were, if you will, radicalized into the gang life. But which gang did you like to deal with the least? I actually answered this knee-jerk in the comments section, and the answer remains the same. Zopound. The Haitian gangs are the worst. Hands down. There's not even an argument or a discussion to be had. Zopound is the worst. I'm curious, how did you make it through jail and prison and such? You just keep your head down mostly. 95% of it is that. I always equated jail and prison to what people complained about in old war in the battlefield. It's 95% nothing and 5% holy shit, what's happening now. So mostly you just keep out of the way as much as you possibly can. Between that and making yourself as useful as possible to a select group of people, that's all you need. Did you ever rape or get raped while inside? This is the most common question for someone that gets out of prison. No. I didn't, and I wasn't. I don't even think it happened in the level that I was at. Any sex that occurred in medium or minor security prisons, it's consensual till they get caught. What are some of the strangest ways common behavior outside of prison can be interpreted inside of prison? For instance, can good morning spoken to someone you pass in the hallway get you in trouble? No, not usually, but nobody would do that. It would just be seen as you're a quirky fuck. They'd probably think you were nuts. If you greeted people as you walked by, hey, what's up, good morning, they'd just think you were fucking strange, honestly. I don't know that you'd be in any danger per se. You might actually stay out of danger because they'd think you were mentally ill. But likelihood is you wouldn't feel compelled to express that kind of emotion. However, interestingly, if you were to walk by someone, stare directly into their eyes, and give them a head nod, depending on the direction your head moved, you could potentially be sending wrong signals. So, yes and no? You are obviously a lover, not a fighter, but was there anyone you had to put in their place? Honestly, no. Not really. I got into a couple scuffles just to prove that I would, but there was no winning or losing. It's more like most fights in prison, are territorial disputes between apes. They're territorial disputes between any mammalians. They don't kill each other. They don't really hurt each other unless they have to. What they're trying to prove is I will, or I can. And as soon as you've done that, then you've found your place in the pecking order and you just move on from there. There's no need for further violence on anyone's part. If the gentleman finds out you told a story about him being humiliated, will he come for your ass? No, and he'll never find out. I changed enough details that, frankly speaking, no one has any idea what facility this happened in. And there are 100 of these guys locked up around the United States of America and the southeastern portion of the United States of America specifically. So I'm not really concerned with that. Not to mention, who gives a shit? These guys in particular are not concerned about what some rando on the internet says. Well, your dad's a CO? Tell him hi and not to get shanked. You ever done acid, shrooms, DMT? It would probably be easier to list what I haven't done than what I have, just for the record. So if your question is, have you? The answer might be yes. More than likely it is. There's like a list of maybe 3 things that the answer is no. And they're the harder substances that you'd be thinking of. I'd be interested in hearing about the greatest sandwich you've ever had. Well, Dick Sissel, let me tell you, once upon a time, a franchise known as Denny's, America's favorite diner, sold a sandwich known as the Dagwood, pictured here. That is the greatest sandwich, empirically. It's not even up for debate. That is the greatest sandwich. What is your estimate as to the racial composition of your prison/jail? What were the dominant factions, and was aligning with a particular fashion a sort of requirement as an incoming inmate? No, again, it's that tears out. I was not in maximum. If I was in maximum, the answer to that would probably be yes. You'd have to find someone. Mostly it was a back-watching system, small cliques. There were factions. I actually got caught up someone tried to make me pass notes between prisoners in different camps of the Aryan Brotherhood just because I was a white guy who they happened to overhear talk about this guy Moon. I literally threw the letter out and never talked to these guys again. I didn't suffer any consequences. You don't have to click up. If you want to get any sort of power, it helps. If you're going to be there a while, I would advise you find something like that. Otherwise, man, it's hard way to do your time. As for the racial composition, it was about 40-60. If you count white Hispanics as white and non-white Hispanics as non-white, I guess. But the area I lived in particular was very white. Once I got to prison, the demographics shifted. Let's say that. Question: do you think the West has a responsibility to remove dictators who commit atrocities against their own people? And how do we keep the country from falling into civil war and being ruined by Islamist movements when we do remove a dictator from power? In my mind, has a pretty simple answer. If we go into a system like that, if we go in and decide that it's worth that, the only solution is to install our own system and to enforce it until it's law. And that's imperialism, and if you like it, cool, we'll accept that it's a necessary evil, and if you don't, then we should probably just fuck right off from these areas. We shouldn't be deposing dictators unless we're essentially willing to dictate what's next. And I don't know that even would work, because I'm not wholly convinced that these areas are, as they say, ready for democracy. So we can confirm that Hagbard in prison is very, very stupid. We can confirm Hagbard pretty much anywhere is very, very stupid. That is a telltale sign. Was there no Aryan Brotherhood or similar group in your prison, or did you just avoid them since you were a short-timer? There was, and I did. I had some dealings with them simply because they were the easiest group for me to deal with no friction, obviously. However, my bunkmate was an older black guy, as I've mentioned. I did business with several of the quote-unquote stores that were run by non-white individuals. My chest tattoo was done by someone who was non-white. There were no consequences to that. There are no consequences unless you're a member, if you will. And I never clicked up. Do you believe in white privilege? Do you believe in black privilege? If so, how do you think this privilege manifests? I think that each group is given a modicum of privilege given to any situation that they're in, due to the fact that this privilege, white/black privilege, is probably better understood as nothing more than majority privilege. If you're in a situation where the majority of the people are white, then some things might be more difficult for you to do. If you're in a situation that is majority black, some things are more difficult for you to do. Let me tell you, finding a hairbrush in prison, run by the state of Florida, that's a no-go. There are no hairbrushes. There are these little horse bristle brushes that work to comb out black hair, but there's no brush. Is that a privilege? Was I being discriminated against for being a white guy? Or did maybe the prison just cater to its largest customer base? What do you think the next front of the SJW war will be? Or do you think the current front will expand and escalate before a new front opens up? I'm disquieted speaking about them in terms of fronts. I think of them more as a globular mindset, and unless, again, as I spoke of before, we take the whole power structure away from the victim narrative, it's never going to go away. It'll always just manifest with the next party claiming to be the true victims. My question for your Q&A is, any other slang terms for prison you think it might be interesting to know? Yeah, Google Fifi. That ought to be fun. Were there any homosexual gangs in prison? What was their status in prison? No, there were no homosexual gangs. That is purely a fabrication of the HBO TV series Oz. Never existed as far as I knew. That being said, the status of homosexuals in prison, depending on, again, what stage you're at, is essentially they're just left alone. No one gives a shit. No one rapes gay guys in prison unless you're in maximum security, where it's essentially just assumed you'll get used to it, as dark as that sounds. And this is from Polly, and it's actually a handful of questions. You have probably already been asked this, but since it's your fandom, what are your top 2 conspiracy theories of all time? I like the overwhelming sphere of the Black Madness conspiracies, the whole Afrocentric conspiracies. Black man has been forced down by the white man, all the history stuff. That's an amazing set of conspiracies, and no conspiracy is a singular conspiracy so far as I've come to enjoy. And matching that, because I don't have a 1 and 2, this is in no particular order, anything David Icke has ever talked about ever. His set of conspiracies is the most in-depth and well-studied set of conspiracies I've ever read into in my entire life, and essentially it encompasses anything you can possibly think of. So just like the whole Afrocentric conspiracy, I would advise it if you're looking for a worldview. Did the ex who helped cause your almost demise ever apologize? Nope. Nope, as far as I know, she moved back north and probably still shooting Oxycontin. What did you miss most while you were in? Fresh fruit. I missed fresh fruit and cigarettes and weed. That was it. Fresh fruit, though. Fuck. I'll never forget that feeling. The alt-right, in the vein of Richard Spencer and others, are trying to craft a pan-white identity for white people in America. Do you believe he will be successful and identity politics will be a baton that passes from left to right, or do you believe that identity politics will be evicted from the political discussion once the social justice progressives are defeated? Again, I believe I kind of answered this in reference to the question by Charming Man. However, I will expand. I do think that this will go back and forth. Even if Richard Spencer per se doesn't get anywhere and get a whole lot of traction, this isn't going anywhere. The unfortunate fact is that the white identity that you're discussing existed once, briefly, but it did exist once, and we realized it maybe wasn't a great idea, and we beat it out of all of our societies. Now, the problem is that other identitarian movements have arisen, and in forming, just naturally, and this isn't even like they did it on purpose or it was some sort of conspiracy, but just naturally by simply formulating other movements and groups around tighter and tighter niches of ethnicity and identity and sexuality, they inevitably isolated the idea of whiteness and maleness. And that's where we're at now. They created and forged this identity that had previously been discarded. And the irony being that it's the identity they most despise, which essentially had already ceased to be or have any sort of sociological meaning. And now it's back. What's your best prison story? I don't know. As I tell them, I'll let you guys decide that. Could you explain more about the cultures between the major tribes in the penal colony? Also, are there any benefits of getting inked? I've heard a bunch of candy asses have angel wings. Would I get major street cred for a tramp stamp of Wilson from Home Improvement complete with fence? You know, I don't think you'd get a whole lot of credit for that, but it's a fuck of a good story if you've got one. I mean, Jesus, that would be a conversation starter. And trust me, there's nothing more someone needs in prison than more conversation starters. So, could be a benefit there. I don't advise getting angel wings in particular. I don't advise getting devil wings on your back or anything like that. It's not a great idea. Just simply from an aesthetic viewpoint, it's markedly feminine. And are there any benefits of getting inked? Yeah, credit, mostly. Whoever you, like in my example, I was used in one instance as a test dummy, and that got me some credit, and then it paid for my chest tattoo. So it's kind of interesting the way that ink works in prison, because a lot of it is guys realizing they need a trade when they get out, and tattooing is something that they can do with very little qualifications and make pretty good money. My question, do you have a recommended reading list that could help someone with a limited background in history/political science understand the current political climate? If I had to recommend just 2 books for you to read to understand the current political climate, it would be Machiavelli's The Prince and The 48 Laws of Power, because those 2 books essentially will give you the tools you need to understand any political or social situation. Hagbard must have been somewhat of a curiosity in prison, I would imagine. I was, on several levels. Not only were my charges not something that were normally warranting of prison time, to the point where the first guard that unloaded me from a bus commented on it, to the fact that by the end of my time they just called me the professor and asked me stupid fucking random questions about what was going to happen when they got out and what the life was like out there, and all kinds of detailed questions. It was quite interesting. Would you rather receive corporal punishment instead of jail time? Well, that depends on the corporal punishment, how severe and for what crimes, and what the jail time alternative is, because I'll tell you, I'll take a 30-day sentence over some permanent scars on my back, but we can have a discussion about more serious crimes. Also, how do you think Antifa members would fare in lockup? They don't fare well. Skinny, white, anarchist-style guys tend to not do well, in short. And I saw quite a few of them. I don't know if you care, but what are your thoughts about BAM and that shit Sargon and V talked about? I'm not a big fan of BAM. Interestingly enough, I researched BAM for this channel maybe about a year and a half ago, and I don't even want to give them airtime. They're a nightmare organization. Essentially speaking, if Antifa, in the metaphor I built for the video on Sargon's channel, is the KPD, then BAM is the Frontkampfverband. They're significantly worse. But that's the Q&A for me, ladies and gents. I'll be back next week with my usual content. I hope I answered your questions at least in passing here. If you have any more, feel free to leave them in the comments section, and I'll save them up for my next Q&A. As usual, stay safe, good luck, and goodbye.